The fluorescent lights buzzed like a swarm trapped in plastic. Danielle Ross moved through Oak Creek Memorial's third floor at 11:47 p.m., her footsteps barely audible on the polished tile. Night shift. Always night shift. The same corridor she'd walked for 3 months now, past the same sleeping patients, past the same nurse's station where nobody looked twice at the quiet woman with the limp that favored her left leg. She pushed the crash cart into the supply alcove, muscle memory taking over. Defibrillator pads arranged in the exact sequence they'd need to be. Ambu bag with the valve set to full oxygen delivery. Epinephrine 1 mg pre-filled syringes lined up like ammunition. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this under mortar fire in Sanjan Valley, who'd held dying men together when the alternative was leaving them behind. The precision never left. It just wore scrubs now instead of a uniform. The supply room smelled like antiseptic and industrial plastic, sharp enough to cut. Danielle paused, breathing through her mouth the way she'd learned in field hospitals where the smell of blood could break your concentration at exactly the wrong moment. She began her inventory, checking boxes against the printed sheet clipped to her paperwork. The mundane work steadied her. Numbers. Quantities. Things that made sense. Things you could control. 4th row, 3rd shelf. Suture kits. She stopped. The invoice stapled to the box read $1,440 for a case of 6 surgical suture assortments. She'd ordered these same kits 2 weeks ago. $40 per kit. That was the standard price, the price she'd verified through 3 separate medical supply catalogs during her first month. Her jaw tightened. Not from anger. From recognition. Pain is data, she'd learned that a long time ago. And the data was screaming. She photographed the invoice with her phone, her movements careful and deliberate. The camera click was barely audible, swallowed by the ambient hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of monitors from patient rooms. She continued her inventory as if nothing had registered. As if her entire nervous system hadn't just switched into a different mode of operation. The mode where you notice everything. The mode where you survive. 2 floors above, in room 312, the blind Navy SEAL lay in the hospital bed with his head tilted toward the window, though there was nothing to see there but his own reflection in the dark glass. His name was Marcus. That was all Danielle knew. That was all he'd told her. The surgical bandages covered his eyes from temple to temple, a white band that made him look like he was sleeping, though his right hand kept reaching toward the edge of the mattress as if trying to locate something solid to hold. She entered his room at 12:32 a.m., her ID badge clipped to her scrub pocket, her movements deliberate and quiet. Some patients startled if nurses appeared without warning. Marcus's hand froze. "It's Ross," she said. The name felt strange in her own mouth, truncated, civilian. "Time to change your dressing." "Yeah." "Okay." His voice was rough, still carrying the gravel that came from 3 weeks of post-operative recovery. He'd been in a Black Hawk helicopter when an electrical fire had damaged the instrument panel. He'd survived the crash. The emergency landing had cost him his eyes. The surgery had cost him hope. That was what the chart said. That was what his wife's red-rimmed expression had communicated through the hospital corridors when she thought nobody was looking. Danielle worked with the precision of a master jeweler. Saline solution to dissolve the old dressing. Gentle pressure to avoid disturbing the healing tissue beneath. Her fingers were steady, the hands of someone who'd sutured jugular veins in tents lit by chemical light sticks, who'd wrapped abdominal wounds with battlefield gauze and whispered lies about survival rates. These small dressings, this controlled environment, this patient who wasn't bleeding out on a stretcher, this was mercy compared to the work she'd done before. She adjusted the new dressing, letting her movements be felt rather than heard. Some patients needed to know where hands were coming from. She'd learned that the hard way. But Marcus stayed still, letting her work. His left arm lay across his chest, and there, on his forearm, the tattoo caught the overhead light. Block letters, dark blue ink faded to navy by time. D. Ross. Her hands paused for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds that felt like a deployment. 2 seconds where she could have spoken. Could have said something. Could have broken 6 years of deliberate anonymity with 3 words, "That's me." She finished the dressing instead. "Looks good," she said. Her voice was level, professional, belonging to someone named Danielle who worked nights at a hospital in Denver and had no connection to any past that might have someone's name tattooed on his body as a permanent memorial to something neither of them was supposed to survive. "You ever been in the military?" Marcus asked. The question hung in the air like a held breath. "Why do you ask?" Danielle kept her hand on the dressing, monitoring the tape adhesion. "The way you move," he said. "You move like someone who knows what they're doing. Not like a regular nurse. Like, I don't know. Like you've done this before. Somewhere else." She removed her hand, stepped back, and adjusted the fall line. "I've been a nurse for a while." "How long?" "Long enough to get good at it." She left the room at 12:47 a.m., pulling the privacy curtain closed behind her. Through the thin fabric, she heard him exhale, heard him reach for the call button and then stop, heard him settle back into the darkness that had become his permanent address. She did not look back. She did not flinch. The trembling, if there had been any, was restraint, not fear. The nurse's station was empty when she passed. Most of the day staff had clocked out. Most of the night shift was in patient rooms or making notes in the electronic charts. Danielle sat at the vacant station and pulled up the supply inventory system. Her hands moved across the keyboard with the same surgical precision she'd used on Marcus's bandages. Patient numbers. Equipment codes. Invoice histories. She'd learned this system in the first week, had understood its architecture by day 3. When you'd spent 12 years coordinating life-or-death logistics in combat zones, civilian hospital supply management was elegant in its simplicity. The pattern emerged in minutes. Suture kits marked at 300% of cost. Dressing packages inflated by 250%. Wound irrigation solutions that should have been $30 showing up on invoices at $120. The numbers climbed in a deliberate, careful gradient, just enough to avoid immediate audit triggers, just enough to distribute the burden across so many line items that casual inspection would miss it. She photographed 3 more invoices before the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Dr. Hargrove appeared at the nurse's station with the casual authority of a man who'd never questioned his right to occupy space. His expensive watch caught the fluorescent light, a Rolex, probably, though Danielle had never bothered to learn the distinction between luxury watches and functional ones. His eye swept across the desk, registered her presence with the attention one might give to a piece of furniture, and then moved past her. "I need the supply reports," he said to the empty air around her. "The last 90 days. Danielle pulled up the file without answering. She printed the document with the efficiency of someone who'd anticipated the request. When she turned to hand them over, she kept her eyes at chest level, submissive and unremarkable. The timid little floor nurse. That was what she'd overheard one of the residents call her last week. Timid. As if timidity were a fixed thing. As if someone who flinched at raised voices couldn't also hold for wounded men in her arms while running through enemy fire. As if the world's categories were that simple. Dr. Hargrove took the papers without acknowledgement, scanning them with the speed of someone who wasn't actually reading, just confirming that the documents existed. Then his gaze shifted back to her, slow and deliberate, the way a predator establishes dominance by making something look at them first. "You're new to night shift," he said. Not a question. 3 months, Danielle replied. Her voice was soft. Exactly as soft as someone should sound at 1 in the morning when the hospital was mostly sleeping. "And how's that working out?" His tone carried the particular warmth of someone asking how you felt about a punishment you'd volunteered for. "Fine. I prefer nights." He smiled. It wasn't a kind expression. It was the smile of someone examining something he'd already decided was disposable. Then he turned and walked back toward his office, the supply reports tucked under his arm, and Danielle remained at the nurse's station with her hands folded on the desk, her heart rate at exactly where it needed to be, her breathing level and controlled. What she'd just seen in those invoices, the inflation, the pattern, the systematic nature of it, meant that Dr. Hargrove wasn't stumbling through corruption. He was orchestrating it. Someone was paying him money that didn't belong to him, and someone else was signing off on equipment purchases that cost more than they should. A supply company. A kickback scheme. The kind of thing that required people who wouldn't ask questions. The kind of thing that required compliance staff. She was not that staff. But Dr. Hargrove didn't know that yet. He was still operating under the assumption that people like her, quiet, deferential, disposable, came without the capacity for observation. Without the training to notice patterns. Without the ability to become dangerous when circumstances required it. She returned to her rounds at 1:20 a.m. Checked on patients. Adjusted monitors. Administered medications at the correct intervals through the correct routes. She moved through the hospital like a shadow, the kind of employee nobody noticed until something went wrong, and by then it was already too late to do anything about it. In room 312, Marcus slept, his breathing steady and even, his hand finally relaxed at his side. The tattoo on his forearm rose and fell with each breath. Didnt Ross. She'd carried that man 3 miles through Helm and Province terrain, had called in extraction coordinates while rounds snapped past her head, had refused to put him down even when her legs felt like they were filled with sand and her shoulder was leaking blood fast enough that she'd started counting her remaining breaths in single digits. He didn't know her name was Danielle. He didn't know the tattoo meant she'd survived something he thought she'd died doing. He didn't know what was about to happen at Oak Creek Memorial. But soon, everyone would. The conference room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and linoleum polish. Fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous drone overhead as Dr. Hargrove stood at the head of the table, his tailored suit catching the harsh light like polished armor. 40 staff members filled the room, nurses, residents, administrative staff, all watching him with the careful attention people reserve for powerful men who enjoy an audience. "I'm making a public wager," Dr. Hargrove announced, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His eyes found Danielle where she stood near the back, still in her scrubs from the night shift, hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Our timid little floor nurse here won't last the week. Any takers?" Laughter rippled through the room like a contagion. Someone snorted. A resident elbowed his colleague. The sound had the particular cruelty of a group that had already decided the joke was funny before the punchline landed. Danielle took one measured breath. Her jaw didn't clench. Her shoulders didn't tighten. She maintained eye contact with Dr. Hargrove for exactly 3 seconds, then looked away, not in shame, but with the calculated disinterest of someone examining something no longer worth her attention. She said nothing. The silence that followed her non-response seemed to confuse him more than an argument would have. He expected resistance. He expected trembling. He got neither. What he got was absence. 3 days later, the cafeteria at noon was a microcosm of hospital hierarchy. Attending physicians clustered at one table near the windows, residents scattered at adjacent tables, nurses and support staff filling the periphery. Danielle carried her lunch tray, turkey sandwich, apple, water, moving through the landscape of white coats and stethoscopes with the invisible efficiency of someone trained to navigate dangerous terrain. She didn't see Dr. Hargrove's foot extend from beneath the doctor's table. The tray flew from her hands. Gravity did its work. Turkey sandwich tumbled across the linoleum. Apple rolled under a trash can. Water bottle struck the floor and exploded upward in a crystalline arc before raining down on her scrubs. The sound of impact, ceramic plate shattering, plastic clattering, 40 heads turning in unison, seemed to echo longer than physics allowed. "Clumsy," Dr. Hargrove said loudly, his voice pitched to carry across the entire cafeteria. "Just like your charting." Danielle kneeled. Her movements were economical, efficient, no fumbling, no panic. She began gathering the fragments with her bare hands, the broken ceramic cool against her palms. One tear escaped from her left eye. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with him, her gaze holding steady as she rose to her feet, the ruined lunch gathered in her cupped hands. When she spoke, her voice came out like still water, calm, measured, carrying a depth that seemed to surprise everyone who heard it. "I've picked up heavier things than your ego, Doctor." Scattered nervous laughter rippled through the cafeteria, the kind of sound that belonged to people who weren't sure if they were supposed to be amused or frightened. Dr. Hargrove's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His hand curled into a fist on the table. The moment stretched between them like a held breath, and then she turned away, disposing of the ruined food, leaving him sitting in the wreckage of his own cruelty. That evening at the nurse's station, with the shift change creating a brief window of controlled chaos, Dr. Hargrove approached Danielle with a stack of patient charts tucked under his arm. His voice carried the false gentility of a predator circling wounded prey. "Pick that up, sweetheart. And do try to get the filing right this time." The charts fell from his hands and scattered across the floor like autumn leaves, dozens of them, papers sliding in all directions, orders and notes and medication records fanning across the tile. Danielle kneeled again, moving with methodical precision as other staff members deliberately looked away, unwilling to make eye contact or offer assistance. As she gathered the papers, her hand froze for just a fraction of a second. Clipped to several of the order forms were invoices from MedSupply Solutions, the same vendor whose name appeared repeatedly in the hospital's procurement records. One invoice showed a quantity of sutures listed at $420 per box. Danielle had assisted in surgical cases. She knew the actual cost was $40. She photographed the discrepancy with her phone, tilting the screen away from view, the camera shutter functioning silently. A second invoice detailed equipment quantities that didn't match the requisition forms, ordered quantities higher, received quantities mysteriously lower, the difference never reconciled. She photographed that one too, her hands moving with practiced invisibility. Dr. Hargrove noticed the hesitation. His eyes narrowed to slits. He watched her as she finished gathering the charts, as she walked back to the filing station. When she turned away, he was already pulling his phone from his pocket, his fingers moving across the screen with the urgency of someone dealing with a problem that had suddenly become unsolvable. "We may have a problem," he said into the phone, his voice low enough that only nearby staff could catch fragments of his words. "The nurse. The one I told you about. I think she's asking questions." That night, in the supply room of Oak Creek Memorial, Danielle moved between shelves with a penlight and her phone. The supply room after midnight was a different world, no staff, no activity, just rows of medical equipment and pharmaceutical stock and carefully organized invoice records. The fluorescent overhead light flickered on when she entered, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made time feel suspended. She photographed invoice after invoice. MedSupply Solutions. Equipment ordered at prices that bore no relationship to market value. Quantities that arrived and disappeared into the hospital's labyrinthine accounting system without proper documentation. Suture kits priced at $400. Cardiac monitors marked up 300%. Trauma supplies listed at double their actual cost. Each photograph she took felt like picking up a brick, carrying it one step closer to a confrontation she wasn't sure she was ready for. She created a hidden folder on her phone labeled Maintenance Records, innocent enough that no one would question it. The photographs went in there, files numbered and dated. She did the calculations in her head, adding up the discrepancies, understanding with the clarity that came from having been trained to process information under fire that Dr. Hargrove wasn't just siphoning money from the hospital. He was doing it systematically, skillfully, with the precision of someone who had refined this particular form of theft into an art. Meanwhile, Dr. Hargrove's documented cruelty intensified with calculated precision. He submitted complaints to her nursing supervisor, forms written in careful language that made incompetent sound clinical. Concerns about professional competence, he wrote. Unexplained employment gap in personnel history, candidate evasive about previous experience. Medication error reports appeared in her file, each one forged with meticulous detail, her initials traced by someone who had studied her signature until they could replicate it with disturbing accuracy. One afternoon, Danielle found herself in the room of the blind seal. His name was Mitchell. He had been recovering well, his surgical site healing cleanly, his vital signs stable. She was changing his dressings with practiced efficiency when he spoke without preamble, his sightless eyes pointing toward a corner of the room. "You former military? Your hands move like a corpsman." The question landed with the force of a physical blow. Danielle's fingers froze against the bandage she was securing. Her breath caught, just for a moment, barely perceptible, but there. "No," she said quietly. "Just trained well." He tilted his head, and she could see him processing her voice, her accent, the particular quality of her movements. His fingers moved to the tattoo on his forearm, 3 letters and a dot, dark ink against tanned skin. "Didnt Ross." "You sure?" he said. "Something about your voice. Can't quite place it." She changed the subject with the ease of long practice, asking about his recovery timeline, his pain level, whether physical therapy had been scheduled. He let her redirect the conversation, but she could feel his attention remaining fixed on her, his sightless gaze somehow more penetrating than normal sight would have been. That night, back in her apartment, Danielle stood in the darkness staring at the photographs on her phone. Invoice after invoice. Discrepancy after discrepancy. Each image represented a choice: report what she'd found, or disappear deeper into silence. If she reported it, the investigation would be internal at first. Then external. Then audit teams would arrive from the state, from insurance companies, from federal agencies. They would pull every thread, every record, every background check. They would ask questions about employment gaps. They would search for explanations about why a woman with medical training had disappeared from military service and reappeared in a Denver hospital 3 months ago. They would find her. She deleted the photos. Watched the folder empty. Felt the relief of erasing evidence. Then she went to her trash folder, pressed restore, and watched all those damning images reappear on her screen. Danielle stood in the apartment's tiny kitchen at 2 in the morning, rain hammering against the window like applause for a performance she hadn't volunteered to give, her phone in her trembling hands, though she wouldn't have admitted the trembling was fear. She would have called it something clinical. Information processing. Tactical assessment. The physical manifestation of competing imperatives. In the darkness, she understood something that civilian life had tried hard to teach her to forget: silence was never actually neutral. The supply room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like plastic and antiseptic, the kind of sterile, chemical odor that masked what lay underneath. Danielle moved between the shelves with the deliberate precision of someone cataloging a weapons cache. To any observer, she was simply restocking. To herself, she was documenting a crime. A suture kit marked at $412. Retail value $98. She photographed it with her phone, the flash off, the angle precise. The image barely visible in the dim light, but clear enough. The timestamp read 11:53 p.m. She moved to the next shelf. Orthopedic braces ordered by the dozen, logged as emergency stock, equipment never opened, never used, rotating through inventory like poker chips in a high-stakes game. $3,000 per order. Minimum 12 orders per quarter. She knew the math. She'd been trained to calculate supply chains under fire. Her hands moved methodically. No trembling. No hesitation. Just data. Just documentation. The fluorescent fixture above her hummed its monotonous frequency, and she noted the sound the way she'd once noted the sound of incoming mortars: information, nothing more. What Danielle didn't know was that in a downtown Denver restaurant called Solera, Dr. Hargrove was already 3 drinks ahead of the conversation that would seal her fate. The 3 men across the table from him represented 40 years of cumulative institutional power. Board member Sterling had connections to the hospital's primary medical supplier. Board member Conrad controlled the credentialing committee. Board member Hayes sat on the state health department's regulatory panel. They didn't wear their authority visibly; authority of that weight never needed to announce itself. It moved through rooms like a pressure change before a storm. "The fraud isn't the issue," Hargrove said, fork suspended between plate and mouth, his tone conversational as a golf discussion. "The issue is the nurse who started asking questions about our invoicing patterns. Sterling's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. How many questions? Enough. She's young, quiet, doesn't seem like a threat. That's the advantage. She moves through the hospital like she belongs there, and no one's paying attention to what she's documenting. Hargrove set his fork down with deliberate care. But she will be a problem if she gets curious enough to go to administration. Conrad leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. A gesture of calculation. What do you need? I need her credentialed reviewed. Thoroughly. She has a 6-year employment gap she won't explain. Personal reasons, she says. I need that gap examined. I need irregularities found, real or constructed, I'm not particular. I need her file flagged for investigation before she becomes a liability. Hayes smiled without warmth. I can initiate an external credentialing review. Board member request. It's routine enough that it won't raise flags, but comprehensive enough to take time. How much time do you need? 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Just long enough to establish that she's unreliable before she can establish that I am. The 3 men exchanged glances that required no words. They'd done this before. They'd done this successfully. Sterling raised his wine glass in a subtle gesture of agreement. The message was clear, the machinery was already turning. What Dr. Hargrove didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that he was playing chess against an opponent who'd spent 18 years learning that patience was a weapon. He was moving pieces across a board that Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross could read like a map. But first, he had to isolate her completely. The call started the next morning. Hargrove's voice on the phone was honeysmooth, concerned, the tone of a colleague looking out for institutional interests. He reached Danielle's previous employer in Seattle First, a private clinic where she'd worked 3 years before transferring to Denver. I'm just doing due diligence on a candidate. Strong candidate. But there's a significant gap in her employment history. 6 years. Did she mention anything about that to you? The clinic administrator, a woman named Patricia Chen, hesitated. She'd like Danielle. But Patricia also knew that hospitals were litigious places. She said it was personal family matters. That was all she would say. I see. Hargrove let the silence sit. Let the implication breathe. And during her employment with you, did you notice any instability? Any concerning behavioral patterns? Mood fluctuations? Patricia felt the weight of the question. It was designed to prompt doubt, to reframe every normal human moment as potential pathology. No. She was professional. Reliable. But reserved. Kept to herself. Yes. Thank you, Patricia. That's helpful. It wasn't helpful. It was poison. Hargrove had just planted the seed that Danielle's quiet reserve might actually be something darker, something that required monitoring. He made for more calls that afternoon. Each one used the same careful language. Each one emphasized the employment gap. Each one suggested that her reticence about her past might indicate instability rather than professionalism. By the time the external credentialing investigator arrived at Oak Creek Memorial, she carried a file already thick with implications. The investigator's name was Margaret Walsh, and she had the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years separating truth from narrative. She requested Danielle's complete personnel file, every document, every evaluation, every shift record for the past 3 months. Then she requested a meeting. The HR office was located on the 3rd floor, windowless, painted in that particular shade of institutional beige that no one had chosen deliberately. Danielle sat across from Margaret Walsh and felt the weight of scrutiny like a familiar pressure. Not uncomfortable. Just present. The investigator's glasses were half frames, and she looked at Danielle across them with the expression of someone reading fine print. Your employment history shows you began working in healthcare 7 years ago, Margaret said, consulting her file. But before that, there's a 6-year gap. 2017 to 2023. That's correct, Danielle said. What were you doing during that time? Personal family matters required my attention. Margaret made a note. Can you be more specific? Danielle understood the architecture of this moment with absolute clarity. Every word she said could be twisted. Every honest detail about her military service would create a new vector of attack. So she gave Margaret exactly what she could verify nowhere. I was caring for a family member with a serious illness. I needed time away from professional work. When I was ready to return to the workforce, I moved to Denver and began nursing. The investigator who reviewed your credentials noted that you don't list military service. Danielle's expression didn't change, but something shifted beneath her skin, not fear, but recognition. They were searching. They were looking for anything to use against her. I don't list it because my previous employment was confidential. Margaret's pen stopped moving. Confidential employment. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details. This was the truth. It was also the thing that would alarm administrators more than any lie. Classified work. Government contracts. The kind of background that required federal clearance. The kind of thing that hospitals didn't want anywhere near their employee rosters if it came with complications. Margaret closed her file. I'll need to verify your claims with the Department of Defense. That process can take time. In the interim, I'm recommending that you remain available for further questioning. Your employment status is not affected at this time, but your personnel file is flagged for intensive review. Danielle stood. Understood. Margaret paused as Danielle reached the door. For what it's worth, your nursing evaluations are exceptional. It's the gaps that are concerning, not the work itself. Danielle didn't respond. She'd learned a long time ago that the kindness of people trying to do their jobs didn't mean you could trust the system they were part of. By that evening, Danielle was moving through the hospital's corridors with a different kind of awareness. Every camera. Every witness. Every potential question. She understood what Hargrove was doing, not attacking her directly anymore, but constructing a narrative of suspicion. Creating institutional doubt. Turning her own secrecy against her. She went to check on the blind seal anyway. His name was Marcus, and he'd been there for 6 weeks now, recovering from septic complications related to his original injuries. The pain medications had been adjusted, and he slept more easily. When Danielle entered his room, she found him awake but quiet, his daughter Emma sitting beside the bed. Emma was sharp-eyed and observant in the way of people who'd learned to compensate for a parent's blindness. She tracked Danielle's movements as the nurse adjusted the fall line, checked the dressing on his leg wound, made notes on the chart. "You're very precise," Emma said. "Do you have a medical background beyond nursing?" Danielle kept her attention on the cardiac monitor. "All nurses are trained in assessment." "That's not what I meant." Emma leaned forward slightly. "My father has talked about his medic during his service. The one who pulled him and 3 others out of an ambush in Sanjin Valley. He said that medic had hands that moved like they were solving a puzzle, like everything was connected and she understood the pattern." Emma watched Danielle's hands continue their work. "He said her name was Ross." The monitor beeped steadily. Danielle didn't look up. That must have been an incredible medic. He was. She was. That's the thing, my father's never forgotten her. Emma's voice carried something like recognition, as if she were testing whether Danielle would admit to being found. "He has her initials tattooed on his arm. D. Ross. Senior Chief," he said. "She saved his life, and about 6 others that day." Danielle's hands continued moving. Checking the line. Adjusting the angle. Making sure the dressing was secure. All of it automatic now, born from thousands of hours of repetition, from decisions made under fire, from a version of herself that no longer existed in any official capacity. "Your father was fortunate," Danielle said finally. "Good medics make all the difference." But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the worst part was that somewhere in a hospital executive corridor, Dr. Hargrove was opening an email from Margaret Walsh, flagged urgent, containing the initial results of her investigation. She'd found discrepancies in Danielle's background check, insufficient documentation, unclear employment history, no verifiable military records. Nothing illegal. But nothing clear enough either. Everything was in that grey space where suspicion could flourish like fungus in darkness. He read the line that made him almost smile: recommend proceeding with formal suspension pending complete credentialing review. Employee will be notified within 48 hours. The machinery was working exactly as designed. The hallway outside the nurse's station smelled like antiseptic and fluorescent light, that sterile calm that exists in hospitals right before everything breaks. Danielle was updating a chart when the sound came. Not a crash. Not a yell. Just the soft, terrible sound of a body hitting linoleum. A man in his 60s, visiting his daughter down the corridor, collapsed mid-stride. His face had gone the color of old concrete. Danielle was moving before conscious thought caught up. She dropped beside him, fingers already pressing against his neck. Carotid pulse weak. Thread thin. His skin was cold and clammy, sweat beading across his forehead like condensation on a window. His breathing came in short, gasping pulls, air hunger, the body screaming for oxygen it couldn't get because fluid was crushing his heart inside its own sac. Acute tamponade, she said to no one and everyone. The nurses froze. Get me an 18-gauge needle. 50 cubic centimeters syringe. Ultrasound probe. Now. A young nurse stammered, we need to wait for Dr. Hargrove. He'll be dead in 2 minutes. Danielle didn't look up. Move. Dr. Hargrove stood 20 feet away, phone already in his hand to call the code team, paralyzed by protocol and liability. The man on the floor was turning gray. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 75, 68. 61, the monitor screaming its electronic alarm. Danielle's hands moved on their own. Muscle memory. 7 years of training, 2 combat tours in Helmand Province, 53 patients saved in conditions that made this sterile hallway look like a luxury resort. She palpated the landmarks with absolute certainty, the xiphoid process, the angle of approach, the thin membrane separating life from death. A nurse slapped the ultrasound probe into her palm. Cold gel. One quick look to confirm position. The needle went in at a precise 45-degree angle, slipping beneath the xiphoid process like a key in a lock. The syringe was in her other hand. Pull. Blood filled the chamber. Dark red. Pericardial blood. 40 ccs. 50. The patient's eyes fluttered open. His breathing deepened. Color came back to his face like dawn breaking. 90 seconds. That was all it took. The hallway went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the next room wheeze its mechanical rhythm. The patient gasped, "I can breathe," and the words hung in the air like evidence at a crime scene. Danielle stayed on her knees for 1 breath. 2. Then she stood, handed the syringe to a frozen nurse, and said quietly, "Get him to cardiothoracic. Tell them pericardiocentesis performed in hallway. 40 ccs drained. Vital signs stable." She didn't wipe the blood off her hands. Didn't blink. Just turned and walked back to the nurse's station like she'd just refilled a water pitcher. But Dr. Hargrove had seen everything. His face wasn't pale with relief. It was drained of something else, something that looked like fear. He watched Danielle return to her chart, watched her hands move with surgical steadiness, and something shifted behind his eyes. This wasn't just a floor nurse who'd gotten lucky. This was someone dangerous. Someone whose competence was a threat to everything he'd built. Her credentials were solid. Her judgment was sound. She didn't hesitate. She didn't defer. She didn't ask permission. She saved lives the way apex predators hunt, with absolute precision and zero doubt. He walked past her without a word and made a phone call. 48 hours later, Danielle was in HR. Immediate suspension, pending credential review, the HR director said, not meeting her eyes. Hospital access revoked effective immediately. Please turn in your badge. On what grounds? Danielle's voice was flat. Steady. The voice of someone who'd already survived far worse than this. Irregularities in your background check. Classified employment history that hasn't been fully documented. The board has authorized an external investigation. The director slid a manila folder across the desk. You'll be notified of the results within 2 weeks. Danielle didn't open it. She already knew what was inside. Gaps that couldn't be explained without the clearance she'd kept classified, tours that were scrubbed from public records, decorations that lived in a box in her garage because wearing them meant answering questions she'd spent 6 years learning how not to answer. Am I under arrest? She asked. Not at this time. Then I'm free to go. The HR director nodded, still not looking up. Danielle went to her locker. A cardboard box sat on the bench in front of it, waiting. Someone had already packed her things. Her spare scrubs. Her badge. Her stethoscope with the worn earpieces from 1,000 patient conversations. And beneath the scrubs, wrapped in a hospital blanket like something precious, were her combat boots. The leather was scuffed. The laces were frayed. There was still dried mud on the heel from Sanjin, from the day she'd carried a wounded SEAL named Marcus 3 miles through enemy fire with one arm around his waist and her other hand keeping his abdominal wound from opening further. She'd buried those boots in her locker 18 months ago, the same day she'd decided to disappear. Now they were being handed back to her like a prophecy she'd tried to escape. She carried the box to her car in the Denver evening, rain starting to fall. The kind of rain that comes without warning and hammers like it has a personal vendetta. She sat in the driver's seat, engine off, staring at the boots. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, I know what you did. Hospital was better off without questions. You should have stayed that way. She deleted it. The rain got heavier. She drove to the cemetery where her husband was buried, James, who'd known everything and loved her anyway, who died of cancer 3 years ago and left her without an anchor. The headstone was cold under her forehead. Water streamed down her face, indistinguishable from tears. I tried to be normal, she whispered. I tried to just save one life at a time. And I still failed. She sat in her car for 2 hours. The rain hammered the windshield. The combat boots sat in the passenger seat like a question that wouldn't go away. The next morning, Danielle made a decision. She would go back to Oak Creek Memorial. Not to fight. Not yet. Just to collect what was left and say goodbye to the one person who mattered. The blind SEAL was in room for 12. She knew his schedule by heart, dressing changes at 8 a.m., physical therapy at 10, visitors in the afternoon. She waited until visiting hours ended, until the hallway was empty except for the hum of machines and the soft padding of her shoes on tile. He was asleep when she entered. His dark sunglasses rested on the nightstand. His bandages had been changed that morning by someone else's hands. Danielle adjusted his pillow, careful not to wake him, ready to leave without saying anything. Some goodbyes were only meant to exist in silence. But his hand came up and gripped her wrist. Hard. Certain. His head turned toward her voice, her breath, her presence, the subtle shift of air that only happened when someone who mattered was in the room. He whispered a single word. Valkyrie. Her call sign. The name that hadn't been spoken aloud since Sanjin. The name she'd killed when she'd walked away from the Navy. Her hand went still. The world went still. Everything she'd buried for 6 years just erupted through the surface like a fissure in concrete. I know your voice, the SEAL said quietly. I remember your hands. I thought. He stopped. Valkyrie? Danielle couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything except stand there while a man she'd carried 3 miles through enemy fire, bleeding and broken, recognized the woman she'd tried to bury. His daughter stood from the corner chair. Valkyrie? You're a senior chief. The words traveled. A nurse in the hallway stopped mid-stride. Another appeared in the doorway. Danielle's medical file was requested from the background check archive. The floor nurse retrieved it with trembling hands and began reading aloud. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. Navy. Combat medic attached to SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Purple Heart. Her voice cracked on the decorations. A crowd was forming. Not hostile. Just gathering. The way people gather when truth walks into the room wearing scrubs and worn boots. An older man pushed through. Civilian clothes, weathered face, the bearing of someone who'd given orders in theaters where the rules were written in blood. He froze when he saw her. Recognition like a lightning strike. Senior Chief Ross, he said. It wasn't a question. Sanjin. 2016, you carried 4 men to the extraction point under continuous fire. 3 miles. Alone. The blind SEAL raised his arm, showing the tattoo on his forearm. Didnt Ross. This woman. She's the reason I'm alive. Dr. Hargrove appeared at the edge of the crowd, face drained completely of color. The SEAL team leader continued, voice carrying like he was addressing the entire battalion. After Sanjin, you disappeared. PTSD. We looked for you for years. We had Wounded Warrior reach out. He stopped. Studied her. You didn't want to be found. No, Danielle said. The word came out in a voice that belonged to someone else entirely. Not the quiet floor nurse. Not the person who deferred and apologized and took charts thrown at her feet. I didn't. The daughter asked, why are you suspended? What is happening here? Dr. Hargrove's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Answer her, the SEAL team leader said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The elevator doors opened at the far end of the hallway. 2 figures stepped out, badges visible on their waists, moving with the specific purpose of federal law enforcement. FBI agents don't walk into hospitals for nothing. They saw the crowd and adjusted their route toward room 412, toward the center of the gathering, toward Dr. Hargrove, who was finally understanding that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. He'd suspended a Navy SEAL combat medic who'd saved lives under mortar fire. And in trying to bury her, he'd just dug his own grave. The blind SEAL's hand moved faster than thought. His fingers locked around Danielle's wrist as she adjusted his pillow, gripping with the precision of someone whose other senses had compensated for what his eyes could no longer see. He turned his head toward her voice and whispered a single word into the fluorescent-lit silence, Valkyrie. 6 years. 6 years of being nobody, of moving through corridors with her head down, of answering to the floor nurse and absorbing insults like body armor absorbing rounds. 6 years of that single call sign locked inside her chest like a classified document. And now it was spoken aloud by a man whose forearm bore it tattooed in fading black ink, a man she had carried 3 miles through enemy fire while rounds punched through the air like angry hornets, a man whose blood had soaked into her uniform in Sanjin in 2016, a man she had walked away from forever. His adult daughter stood in the corner of the room, visiting for the afternoon. She rose slowly from her chair. You're a senior chief. A nearby nurse heard it. She pulled Danielle's military file from the hospital's background check archive, hands trembling as the pages emerged from the scanner. Her voice shook as she read aloud, Bronze Star with Valor. 2nd Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Navy Cross, carried for wounded men to safety under continuous fire, Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, 2016. The words hung in the room like dust in sunlight. 3 nurses appeared in the doorway. Then a doctor. Then 2 more. Nobody spoke. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, the only sound besides rain hammering the windows outside, rain that fell like applause for the truth that was finally breaking into daylight. The SEAL team leader arrived 30 minutes later. Danielle had never spoken to him, not since she'd walked away from the service, not since she'd erased herself from the roster and become a ghost in scrubs. But she recognized the walk before she recognized the face. That fluid, economical movement. That presence that made the air pressure change when he entered a space. He was wearing a Veterans Affairs ID on a lanyard and a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but nothing about him looked civilian. Nothing ever would. He found Danielle in the hallway outside the blind seal's room. The gathering crowd had grown, 15, maybe 20 people now. Nurses whispering. An administrator with her phone out. The security guard pretending not to listen while pretending to check the fire extinguisher. The SEAL team leader looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned to the crowd and spoke quietly, each word a hammer strike. Bronze star. Pause. Second bronze star. Pause. Purple heart. Longer pause. The crowd held its breath. Navy Cross. Carried for wounded Marines, not men, Marines, through sustained enemy fire in Sanjin Valley in 2016. While bleeding out from shrapnel wounds. While rounds were still coming. While the extraction point was still 600 meters away. He turned back to Danielle. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. 2 tours in Afghanistan. 1 tour in Iraq. Classified recommendation from SEAL Team 3's commanding officer. Commended for field medicine under conditions that would have broken most people. And then she disappeared. And we all assumed she was dead. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. That was all it took. That microsecond of recognition between 2 people who had seen the worst the world had to offer and had decided to live anyway. The FBI agents had been waiting in an office on the 3rd floor. They'd been investigating Oak Creek Memorial's medical supply fraud for 6 months, a systematic kickback scheme that had cost the hospital system over $2 million and had funneled hundreds of thousands into Dr. Hargrove's offshore accounts. They asked to speak with Danielle privately. In a conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, she produced her phone. The photograph she'd documented weeks ago glowed on the screen, rows of inflated invoices, dates and amounts circled in her precise handwriting, each one a small act of rebellion against a man who thought he could break her. I didn't know who to report this to, she said quietly. The words came out with the careful deliberation of someone choosing every syllable. I thought if I raised questions, they'd scrutinize me. And I wasn't ready to be found. The lead agent, a woman with the lean, weathered look of someone who'd spent 20 years fighting institutional corruption, nodded. She'd seen it before. People with secrets choosing silence over righteousness. People choosing safety over justice. Dr. Hargrove has been running this scheme for 4 years. The medical supply company paid him approximately $2.3 million in kickbacks. But we just discovered something else. She slid a document across the conference table. Danielle recognized her own signature on it immediately. She recognized it because it was a forgery. Suspended effective immediately. Medication errors documented in patient care, 3 instances of morphine administration without proper authorization. Failure to follow protocol in emergency situations. Conduct unbecoming a healthcare professional. All of it fabricated. All of it backdated to the day before her emergency pericardiocentesis saved a visiting cardiac patient's life. He forged your suspension paperwork, the agent said. Created a paper trail to justify your termination before you could expose him. That's felony evidence tampering. That's federal. Downstairs in the hospital lobby, Dr. Hargrove was on his phone. His voice was a low hiss of panic. We need to contain this. She's got military connections, FBI is here, I need you to call the board chair right now. The elevator doors opened. 2 FBI agents emerged, walking with the kind of unhurried purpose that meant they already owned the outcome. Danielle followed them, and behind her came the SEAL team leader. And behind him came 15 people who worked at Oak Creek Memorial and had watched Dr. Hargrove humiliate their colleague for months. The lobby, usually scattered with visitors and orderlies, suddenly fell silent. Completely, utterly silent. The kind of silence that only happens when everyone senses they're about to witness something irreversible. Dr. Hargrove. The lead agent's voice was quiet. You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. He tried to speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "This is a misunderstanding, I can explain." Handcuffs clicked. The sound was bright and metallic, final as a coffin closing. The agents turned him toward the exit, and the staff parted like water, creating a corridor of faces, faces of people he had commanded, insulted, intimidated, bribed, controlled. He'd built his authority on their silence, on their fear. Now they stood and watched him walk past them in restraints, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume, his arrogance replaced by the slack-jawed expression of a man who'd finally understood that the world doesn't give a damn about your credentials if you've destroyed your integrity. As he was placed in the FBI vehicle, the SEAL team leader remained motionless at the window, arms crossed, watching with the expression of someone who'd seen worse people receive worse justice and had learned to take whatever small victories the system offered. The flasher lights painted the lobby blue and blue again, reflecting off the glass, and somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren wailed into the Denver afternoon. 2 years later, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove at a strip mall on Evans Avenue, sitting at a folding table outside a discount insurance office. No more tailored suits. No more expensive watch. Just a man in khakis and a polo shirt, greeting indifferent passers-by with the forced cheer of someone who'd lost everything but refused to acknowledge it. He sold supplemental insurance policies at $10 commission per policy. He lived in a studio apartment and drove a 2009 Honda Civic. The board of directors had settled a civil case against him for undisclosed terms. His medical license had been permanently revoked. His life had become smaller and quieter with every passing month until it was barely a whisper at all. But at Oak Creek Memorial, something different was happening. The new Veterans Wing dedication ceremony took place on a crisp October morning. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Denver skyline. In the main corridor, surrounded by hospital administrators, veteran advocates, and the staff who'd worked for months on the expansion, Senior Chief Danielle Ross stood in dress uniform. Dark blue, crisp as a knife edge, every crease perfect. Her blind SEAL patient stood beside her, now a mentor in the hospital's veteran recovery program, his confident gait and steady presence transformed by 2 years of healing. His daughter stood on his other side, her hand in the crook of his arm. On the wall was a shadow box. Inside, a pair of worn combat boots. The leather was cracked and faded, the sole scuffed from miles of patrol, the laces still tied in the double knot that had held them secure through firefights and extractions and the long walk away from everything. Beneath the shadow box was a plaque. Some people save lives in silence until silence is no longer an option. The blind SEAL reached over and touched her shoulder, the gesture simple and profound. "Valkyrie," he said. "Welcome home." Danielle looked at the crowd of faces, nurses who'd stood beside her without knowing her story, doctors she'd worked alongside for 3 years, veterans from across Denver who'd come to see the new wing. She took one measured breath and nodded. The administrator approached with a folder. "Senior Chief, we'd like you to lead the combat trauma training program. Train our entire staff on trauma response for veterans. Develop protocols, curriculum, oversight. Whatever you need." She didn't answer immediately. Her hand rested on the blind SEAL's shoulder, steady as bedrock. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, that command tone that had been there all along, waiting. "I'll need 2 full-time staff, a budget for equipment, and access to the clinical simulation lab." "Done," the administrator said immediately. Danielle walked the same corridor that evening, the one she'd walked on her first night shift 3 years ago, moving quietly through the fluorescent light, invisible. Now her boots clicked against the tile with unhurried authority. A young nurse recognized her and stepped aside. Another called out, "Thank you, Senior Chief." She didn't pause or acknowledge them, just kept moving, her head high, her shoulders back, the ghost finally becoming real. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. Some wear combat boots locked in shadow boxes. Some spend years invisible until someone brave enough calls their name into the darkness and waits for the answer to come back. If you know someone like that, a healthcare worker carrying invisible wounds, a veteran still finding their way home, an unsung hero in your community, share their story. Nominate them. Tell them their name matters. Tell them welcome home. Subscribe for more stories of the quiet warriors walking among us, and let me know in the comments who deserves recognition in your life.